Amen. Well, tonight we're going to be in Daniel chapter 2, and this is about Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And there's a lot of leadership principles in this record. And that's one of the things, when the first time, one of the reasons we need to read the Bible a lot, because the first time you read the Bible, it's like the first time even you read a simple story like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You just know the facts. But then after you read it over and over and over again, you begin to relax into it and say, okay, God, why are you including these facts? Why are you talking about these things? What are you trying to bring to the table? And what comes out is the humanity in the record, the interaction between God and people, how God is bringing his purposes to pass, the kind of how in this case in Daniel chapter 2, we really get an idea about how God has the long view in mind. By the way, Satan does the same thing. Satan's working behind the scenes constantly to make things happen 100 years from now. And God's doing the same kind of thing. He has the long view in mind. And we see that here with Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel chapter 2 says, starting in verse 1, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, when I was new in the word and I was being taught things, one of the things I was taught was the word of God interprets itself. The Bible interprets itself. That is not true. We have to get our understanding, even the vocabulary itself. Like we wouldn't know what Jerusalem was just from the text of Scripture. In fact, now that I think about it, I've got a great example of that. We have this body of water in Israel called the Sea of Galilee. Now, none of the men, like for example, William Tyndale, um, and the men who translated the Geneva Bible, who were in Geneva, Switzerland, and then the people who did the King James Bible in 1611, none of those 54 men had ever been to Israel. And you read the records of Jesus and the boat and the fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, and it would make perfect sense to call this body the Sea of Galilee. Of course, that's not the biblical term for it in the Old Testament. It was called Lake Chinnereth. And the word Chinnereth is the Hebrew word for harp, because if you take an aerial photograph of the Sea of Galilee, it looks like a harp. So that's why they called it the Lake Chinnereth. But the King James translators, the Geneva Bible translators, the translators of the Great Bible and the Bishop's Bible and all those early Bibles, they'd never been there. So they translated it the Sea of Galilee. Well, what do we know about seas? Seas are salt water. By definition, a sea is a body of salt water. A lake is a body of fresh water. The Sea of Galilee is fresh water. And so it should have never been called the Sea of Galilee. That's a misnomer, but they didn't know any better. And so again, see, the Bible didn't just interpret itself. You learn from the culture and from being there and from digging things up what the Bible means. Now here in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, we know from historical records that Nebuchadnezzar had the longest reign of any Babylonian king. He reigned 44 years. Now in in king world, that's an age, because everybody and their brother is trying to assassinate the king. Kings usually don't make it, more than 20, 25 years, and most of them don't make it nearly that long. But Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 44 years, and that tells you not that he was, one of those guys that was just gifted with long life, but I mean, he was in a sense, but also he was very astute, very brilliant, very organized in his government, very good at picking out good men, who's going to be around him, who's not going to be around him, who's going to be allowed to be close to him, who's not, that kind of thing. So here he's in his second year of a 44-year reign. And God's going to give him this dream. So it says Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams. Now, as we work this record, we find out the dreams are from God. So, God could have waited till his 43rd year and given him a dream. and it still would have been a dream to Nebuchadnezzar. But again, so if we draw back and we say, okay, God, what am I learning from this? One thing we're going to learn is that God's playing the long game. Because what's going to happen as a result of this dream, and you guys know the record, basically, if you know the book of Daniel, Daniel's going to be elevated in the kingdom, and that's later going to lead to him being the representative of the kingdom, and we can get into that as we move further along. But this is the long game. So it's the second year of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep went from him. And his spirit here, this is one of the usages of spirit, where your spirit is your thoughts, your mind, your attitude, if you will, your mental activity. So the Bible could have said, and he was troubled, and that would have covered it. But by saying his spirit was troubled, it's kind of letting you into the depths of what's going on in the inner workings of his mind. He's not just kind of wondering or a little bit bothered. He's really troubled. Now, one of the reasons that he's troubled is that, and you may have experienced this, I certainly have, because I'll get an occasional dream from God here or there. But, I've had a couple dreams from God that you wake up and it was so powerful and it made such an impression that you just know this dream is from God. In fact, I didn't even think of this until this very second, but talking about the long game, about 2 weeks ago, I had one of those dreams and I didn't know what it meant and I was troubled. And I still don't know what it meant, but I'm praying about it. And so here he's troubled and his sleep went from him. And we are going to find out that's because the dream was profound and it was from God. And that's what happens when God gives you that kind of dream. So anyway, verse 2, then the king gave orders to call the magicians. And later on, they're kind of the root stock of what you and I know as the Magi. And later on, we find out if you read through Daniel chapter 4, Daniel was made chief of the Magi. And I'm sure Daniel communicated to the Magi what the coming of the Messiah was going to be like. Then the Magi kept that in their historic memory. And so at the time of Christ, the Magi that were alive at that time knew what to look for. And that's how they knew that configuration in the heavens pointed to the birth of the Messiah. Again, God's playing the long game, 600 years long. He's putting Daniel in charge of the Magi more than 600 years before Christ. These Magi are going to see this about 640 years, give or take a couple years later. The Magi are going to see the sign that Daniel taught them about. But in any case, here's verse 2. So the king gives order to the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dream. And these are different groups of people that all basically have the same goal in mind, if you will, which is tapping into secret knowledge that's not well known, whether it's the enchanters or the sorcerers. The Chaldeans were generally astrologers. I've got some commentary on that in the REV commentary. And then the question is, why not pick a group and call them in? Because he's really bothered. Nebuchadnezzar is really bothered by this. So he's going to shotgun. He's going to call everybody in that should have any kind of knowledge about how to get to what this dream means. And that's why he calls the magicians and enchanters, sorcerers, Chaldeans to tell the dream. So they came in and stood before the king. That's a custom. You didn't sit in the king's presence. You can start back early on in the Bible, read through the Bible, and you see that the king's advisors stand before the king. Even Jesus Christ in Acts chapter 7, Stephen gets a vision, and he gets a vision of God sitting on his throne. He says, I see the glory of God, which if you study the glory of God in the scripture, is the presence of God surrounded by this iridescent, brilliant light that you really can't even look into. But that's the presence of God. So And from Isaiah 6, we know that God sits on a throne and he's surrounded by this light. We learn from the book of Revelation that it's resplendent like a rainbow with different colors. And so anyway, that's what Stephen looked up and saw. Here's the glory of God in Jesus Christ standing at God's right hand. So even Jesus Christ is in the position of a servant to the creator of the heavens and earth. And so here we see that same kind of picture. These guys, the soothsayers and Chaldeans, blah, 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 came in and stood before the king. The king said to them, I've dreamed a dream and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Verse 4, then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. By the way, this section of Daniel is written in Aramaic. And these Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, which obviously then the king understood. And why did the king understand Aramaic? Because that was the language in Babylonia that was called Imperial Aramaic. This becomes very important because where were the Jews in captivity? They were in captivity. Remember, the Judeans were captured by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian troops. They were carried off to Babylon, where they learned to speak, we guessed it, Aramaic. And that's why when the Jews came back 70 years later from captivity, most of them spoke Aramaic, and that's how we got to people in the Galilee speaking Aramaic. And then there's huge debates because they had to read Hebrew to read the scrolls. The scrolls were not written in Aramaic, but just like in the Greek world, they translated the Hebrew into Greek in the version that we know as the Septuagint. They took the Hebrew and translated into Aramaic in what we know as the Targums. So there were Aramaic Targums for the Aramaic speakers to read. There were the Septuagint for the Greeks to read, and there were the Hebrew scrolls, which, because they were the original scrolls, educated Jews would read the Hebrew. And so there's huge debates about what language, say the people in Galilee spoke. Jesus Christ is very, I'm sure very linguistic, would have spoken Aramaic, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, a whole bunch of language, because he spoke to Pilate, and Pilate would have spoken Latin, and then he spoke up in the native Galilee, would have talked in Aramaic, goes down, talks to the Sadducees in the temple, would have been in Hebrew. So Jesus was very multilingual. And you and I know as the Messiah, he had to be able to do that to reach all those people. So anyway, the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Standard greeting like we in England say, long live the king or something. Tell your servants the dream and we will show the interpretation. And this is one of the reasons I believe King Nebuchadnezzar was able to reign for 44 years. He was very astute. He picked his people well. He understood when he could be tricked and that kind of thing. So he's like, no, sorry, guys, we're not going to play that game. Verse 5, the king answered the Chaldeans, this is what I have decided. Now, if you're reading the older version, they didn't have as much of a grip on this. So if you're reading the King James Version, for example, it says, the thing is gone from me, as if Nebuchadnezzar had forgotten the dream. That's not what happened. The thing that went out from Nebuchadnezzar was his command. And the modern versions will get that right. If you read the NIV 2011, the New American Standard 2020, New Revised Standard Version, the newer versions, they get this. The older versions, like King James, Geneva, Great Bible, Bishop's Bible, they didn't know the Hebrew as well at the time, didn't have as much background information. And so they said, this is gone from me like I'd forgotten it. But here we see Nebuchadnezzar, and again, what I'm reading into this, when Nebuchadnezzar says, this is what I'm decided, you're looking at a very astute leader who's going to reign for 44 years, and he's not going to be taken advantage of, and he's not going to be tricked. And I bet you, if he lived today, you wouldn't be able to trick him with a computer spam or scam or whatever. Unlike me, who have fallen for at least two of them. In my old age, I'm getting a little smarter, but I'll bet you wouldn't catch Nebuchadnezzar in one of those darn scams. He was onto them. And that tells us something about our leadership. We want our leadership to be sharp. And if we're going to deal in the world as crafty as the world is, we've got to be sharp. So he makes a decision, verse 5. He says, "This is what I've decided. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be cut in pieces, and your houses will be made a dunghill." Now, this is how we learn historic facts from the scripture. This was properly translated long before we were able to crack the cuneiform and find out that, in fact, in Mesopotamia, one of the punishments for people was to cut them in pieces. So this is not something that Nebuchadnezzar is inventing here. This is a Mesopotamian, ancient Babylonian, if you will, punishment. Actually, and it probably leaks back into the Assyrian empires. Oh, it does, because the Assyrians cut people in pieces. But you will be cut in pieces. So this is not like a hyperbole or something. This actually happened to people that made the king angry. They got cut in pieces. And beyond that, your houses will be made a dunghill. Now, that's the word dunghill there has a range of meanings. It literally means a dunghill, meaning a public latrine. But it was also used, according to the cuneiform tablets that we have and can interpret and that kind of thing, that it was also used as kind of hyperbolic, meaning that all we're going to do is ruin your house. So in this case, what did Nebuchadnezzar mean? Did he mean your houses will be destroyed, your houses will be ruined? Or did he say your houses will be made a public latrine? And I think he was angry enough at these people that he would have really genuinely turned their houses into public latrines. But anyway, in any case, those houses would at least be ruined. Verse 6, I love this. But, this is the hook. But, Nebuchadnezzar says, if you show the dream and its interpretation, you will receive gifts and rewards from me in great honor. And of course, we know that was true because Daniel got all that later on. So, and then he says, so, show me the dream and its interpretation. Verse 7, they answered the second time and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. And that, if you want to make the king angry, just simply repeat your request. Don't listen to what he said. Just repeat your request. That's a great way to make about anybody angry. And here we see then in the answer to this, we see Nebuchadnezzar's suspicion and his properly reading characters and that kind of thing, because the king answered, I know for certain that you are buying time. And I thought it was interesting that, we talk about that today. We use that same phraseology. That's actually the literal Aramaic, that you are buying time. And I thought that was interesting that here we are 2,600 years after Nebuchadnezzar spoke, and we still use that same phrase. Even though most English versions don't use the phrase buying time, that is the literal Aramaic. I know you're buying time because you see that this is what I've decided. And so the king knows that what they're trying to do is stalling so they can see if circumstances change. Verse 9, but if you do not make known to me the dream, there is but one sentence for you, for you've prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me until time has changed things. Time changes things in a lot of ways. Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom could come under attack. Something else could come up, a different dream or something, and he could lose interest. There's just a whole bunch of different things. If you can buy enough time, circumstances can change and you can, kind of get out from underneath the pressure. And so he says, if you do not make known to me the dream, there's but one sentence for you. For you have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me until time has changed things. Therefore, tell me the dream, and then I will know that you can show me its interpretation. And there we get the underlying reason for Nebuchadnezzar telling these guys, that you need to show me the dream and the interpretation. The way he knows that they'll get the interpretation right is if they can show the dream. And so that comes out here. In verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there's not a man on earth. And the fact that it's the Chaldeans that answered shows you that the Chaldeans carried more weight. They were more respected, if you will. They were probably a larger group. The historic origin of the Chaldeans, as far as their position here in Nebuchadnezzar's court of advisors, so to speak, is the Chaldeans were a people group that started in northern Mesopotamia, and that's why where Abraham was, is called Ur of the Chaldeans, because the Chaldeans originally started in northern Mesopotamia. Over time, they migrated to southern Mesopotamia toward the Persian Gulf. And it was when they were down by the Persian Gulf that when in Nebuchadnezzar's father's time, when the Babylonian Empire attacked and eventually conquered the Assyrian Empire, the Chaldeans threw their weight and military might in with Nebuchadnezzar and helped him win the war against the Assyrians. That brought the Assyrian Empire to an end, and then produced the ascendancy of what we know as the Babylonian Empire. But that also meant that the Chaldeans became a very important people group in the Babylonian Empire, and that's why the Chaldeans here would speak up. And here in verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. So no king, lord, or ruler has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. Verse 11, the thing that the king is asking is difficult, and there's no one else who can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling place is not with flesh. And this is a very important statement for a reason that we need to pay attention to. Because I know that there are people who get frightened that they think demons can read their mind. But if you have a sound mind, if you don't have a demon sitting in your mind, then demons cannot read your mind. The devil is an angel. He does not have the power to read your mind. And here we see that he says, there's no one. Why did these guys say there's no one else who can show it to the king, show the dream to the king, except the gods whose dwelling place is not with flesh? Normally, the soothsayers and all that are in league enough with demons that the demons can communicate with them and give them the answers. It's the same thing that happens with modern fortune tellers. The modern fortune tellers have a demon, whether it's a divination demon like the woman in Acts chapter 8 who had the python spirit, or what's called in the Old Testament a spirit of divination, that kind of thing. But the fortune teller, the palm reader, whatever it is, has a demon, but the demon knows enough about the life of the person simply from other demons that are around those kind of people, that then the fortune teller can hear from the demon, say this, say that, say the other thing. And that's one of the reasons that fortune tellers can be so accurate, because the demonic world is in communication with each other, and demons that know the person who's come to the fortune teller talk to the demons in the fortune teller, and then the fortune teller can tell you things about you and what's going on in your life. But in this case, here's Nebuchadnezzar, and God gives him the dream from nowhere. There was nothing in Nebuchadnezzar's life or circumstances that would have indicated anything about this particular dream. Therefore, the devil and the demons didn't know it. And because they didn't know it, they couldn't communicate that to the soothsayers and the diviners and the magicians. I hope that makes sense. And basically what it means is if God reveals something to you and you keep your mouth shut, demons don't know it, and the devil doesn't know it. And the only one that knows it is you. And that's exactly what was happening here with Nebuchadnezzar. The only one that knew about his dream was him, because it came directly from God to him, and he hadn't told anybody. So he says, so these guys, the Chaldeans say, what you're asking is difficult, and there's no one else who can show it to the king except the gods. And of course, even they couldn't show it because they didn't know it. God knew it, but God gave the dream. Verse 12. Because of this, because of their response, the king was violently angry and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon, because basically he's like, you guys are charlatans, you're imposters. So he commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Now, what we learned from Daniel chapter 1 was that Daniel, Mishael, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as we know them, they were in training to be part of these advisors. So the king is mad, and he's going to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Verse 13. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be slain, and they searched for Daniel and his companions to kill them. And the question is, why would they have to search for Daniel and his companions? And the answer is, well, they were in training. So they didn't have a specific place where you could look for them and find them. They were out looking around for them. And so verse 13, they searched for Daniel and his companions to kill him, in which, of course, eventually they found him. Verse 14. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch. Now, in the REB, we translated this prudence and discretion. If you read 10 different versions, you're going to get 7 different ways that this is translated. And the reason is that both of these words have a very broad semantic range. So they can be counsel, discretion, prudence, wisdom. There's a whole bunch of different words that fit into the semantic range of these Hebrew words. And that's why the versions differ. And so when you run into this situation, one of the things that you can do is read 5 different versions, kind of get a global idea of what's going on and plug that into the situation. There are times like this when, let me see, I'm going to back that up. There are times when you can look at a word in the Hebrew or Greek, and it has an exact parallel in English. And you can put a laser focus on that and say, this is what it means. But there are situations like this where the semantic range is so broad, it's really getting an idea of what's going on. So you could say Daniel replied with prudence and discretion. You could say Daniel replied by counsel and wisdom. There's different ways you can say this, but the point is that Daniel here is using his mental faculties, and he's thinking this through. How am I mean, his life is on the line. This guy's come to kill him. And so he's got to figure out something to say to save his life. So he's working real hard, to figure out, okay, what can I say that will stop this train enough for me to be able to get God in the picture and see if I can save some souls here and save my life. And so he answers with prudence. We translated it prudence and discretion to Arioch, the commander of the king's guard. And this is another debated word here. And the versions and the commentators go 2 ways. It's generally either the commander of the king's bodyguard or the commander of the king's executioners. And the versions are split. And the fact of the matter is we don't really know because the word can be used in different ways. But what we can tell is that because the king Nebuchadnezzar sent Arioch, he's highly respected and highly trusted. Again, we're looking at Nebuchadnezzar as a man that has great intuitive faculties and he picks his men well. So if Arioch is the commander of his bodyguard, then he trusts Arioch to save his life. And the commander of the bodyguard is really it's a super important position. Everybody's heard of Alexander the Great. Well, Philip of Macedon was Alexander's father. How did Philip die? He was going to a wedding and he had his bodyguard with him. And without knowing it, one of his bodyguard had become angry and upset with him and executed him. You arm your bodyguard so they can protect you. And one of Philip's bodyguards just killed him. And so here's Arioch, and he's the captain of the bodyguard or the captain of the executioners. And that tells you that he is a very powerful person and a very trusted person. And he had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. Verse 15. And he, Daniel, answered and said is an idiom. It means he said. Basically, the word answer comes in because you're answering the situation. People read the idiom answered and said, and they say, well, why does it say answered and said? There's no question. Right. There's not a question, but there's a situation. And so answered and said speaks to the situation. He's answering, if you will, the situation, and said to Arioch, the king's commander, why is the decree from the king so urgent? And the word urgent here, I think that it's used with great care because it can mean urgent and it can mean harsh, has both meanings. And some versions will translate it harsh, some versions will translate it urgent. But I think here urgent is probably the better choice because, the king commanded, go kill the wise men, and man, they picked up their swords and went out to kill the wise men. And so Daniel's going to catch Arioch off guard. Why is the decree from the king so urgent? And for some reason, whatever was behind that, it stopped Arioch from killing Daniel. We don't really know why. Why would that question stop Arioch from killing Daniel? We don't know. But there was something in there, in that question, that stopped Arioch and saved Daniel's life. And again, as we're reading this record and learning from it, mining it for its details, then we say, okay, what am I learning from this? Well, one of the things I'm learning is that somebody can be really upset with me, and if I'll stay in prayer and ask the Lord, maybe I'll get a question that could bring this thing into a peaceful resolution. Is there something I can say? Is there something I can do to bring this into a peaceful resolution, or at least stop this train to where we can get things turned around? Because that's what happened here. And looking at it from the outside, then it's like, huh? Why is the decree from the king so urgent? I don't know what was so powerful about that question, but it stopped Arioch in his tracks, and he told Daniel what was going on. Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. Verse 16. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him some time so he could show the king the interpretation. Now, wait a minute. Isn't that what the Magi asked for? The magicians up in verse whatever? He said, and the answer is no. And this is where we've got to read very astutely. There's a difference because what the Magi said was show us the dream and we'll show you the interpretation. And Nebuchadnezzar sniffed that one out and said, no, you've prepared lying words. Daniel went in and all he said was, can I have some time and I'll tell you the interpretation. He didn't ask to know the dream. And so Nebuchadnezzar's like, yeah, that's a reasonable request. I don't have to show you my hand. I don't have to play my cards. All I've got to do is give you a little bit of time. And my gut feeling is that Nebuchadnezzar, it's not like Nebuchadnezzar said, take all the time you want. I think Nebuchadnezzar is sharp enough. He would have said, okay, you can have, till tomorrow noon or tomorrow evening or, whatever, something. I'm sure that he would have set him a time, but that wasn't really important. It's not germane, doesn't show up in the record. But what does show up is that what Daniel asked was materially different than what the Magi asked. So you ask one question, you get a death sentence. You ask another question, and you get some time. What are we learning from that as we mine the scripture? We learn, choose your questions carefully because it makes a big difference, the question you ask and how it impacts people. So he says, hey, give me some time. I'll show you the interpretation. And the king was like, fine with that. Verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, so that they could request the mercy of the God of heaven, which is what they needed, grace and mercy, concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions would not perish with the rest of the men of Babylon. Now, that would depend on how fast the other men were being killed and how soon God could give Daniel an answer. Verse 19, then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And there's something about the nighttime that life slows down, things calm down. And one of the things we were taught early on was that you get a lot of revelation over quiet seas. Calm your mind down. Sometimes at night, things just calm down a bit. And so here, in a vision in the night, Daniel gets a vision. And I think the reason it was a vision was God had to give Daniel the same vision he gave Nebuchadnezzar. Because if you think about trying to describe that vision in words, it would have been really difficult. So I think God just simply gave Daniel the same vision that he had given Nebuchadnezzar. And that's why it's called a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And I like this because God is the one we give thanks to. He kind of gets top billing. You don't want to ignore God in any way. And so the record takes time out here while there's a prayer to God, a recognition to God, praise to God. And that's something that I think in our hurried lives, we need. This is another lesson that I could learn from Daniel, because sometimes, I'm working the word, and I want some answer, and I feel like I'm guided to go read a particular commentary, and I read the commentary, and there's the answer. And instead of stopping, I'm reproving myself right now. But instead of stopping and saying, thank you, God, this is a great blessing, this is a time saver, you're a great God, appreciate the grace and mercy and all that cool stuff, instead I go charging back to my desk and fill in the blank, so to speak. And so this is, the best reproof comes when I talk about God reproving me through the word. This is how he does it. You're watching this in real time. Okay, John, I was prepared to teach it. It became much more real to me as I'm teaching it. But anyway, Daniel takes the time here to pray. He answered, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings. He sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals the deep and secret things. He knows what's in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. And here darkness and light are used metaphorically. God knows what the dark secrets are, what are the things that people don't know, don't understand. And light, understanding, knowledge, that type of thing dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. Again, recognizing that God is not just his God. He didn't come up with the idea, but he's standing on the shoulders of giants that goes all the way back to Abraham and before. O God of my fathers, who's given me wisdom and might, and has now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. And I love that nifty little prayer. It's short, very sincere, very powerful, and the kind of thing that we need to remember to stop in our busy lives and say prayers like that. Verse 24. So Daniel went in to see Arioch, who the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and spoke to him as follows: Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. That shows something about Daniel's character. The wise men of Babylon, they're pagans. They weren't Jews. Why is Daniel interested in them? Daniel's interested in humanity. He's interested in human life. He's interested in mercy. And I think that if we think about that, the kind of character we need to get God to fully engage with us is a loving, kind, peaceable, giving, sharing, humble, attitude and lifestyle. God says very clearly a couple times in Scripture, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And here you see humility, honesty, love, understanding, where he immediately upon talking to Arioch, the first point of his agenda is don't kill the wise men of Babylon. Save their lives. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the interpretation to the king. So now we get to watch Daniel and see more of how he lives his life. Verse 25, but we also get to see about Arioch, which is kind of an interesting contrast, because in verse 25, Arioch brought Daniel in before the king in haste and spoke to him as follows. Now Daniel spoke to him, Arioch, as follows. Now Arioch speaks to Nebuchadnezzar as follows: I have found a man of the children of the captivity who will make known to the king the interpretation. it's the opposite of Daniel's humility. So you have the way Daniel speaks and the way Arioch speaks, and it just strikes me as an interesting contrast. And we choose how we train ourselves. We choose how we train our conscience. We choose whether we're on a path of humility and love, or whether we're on a path of self-aggrandizement, that kind of thing. The verse 26, then Arioch kind of falls out of the picture. The king answered Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? And now we need to unpack that, because Nebuchadnezzar at this point is remember, the last time we heard about him, it says he was what he was. Where did it say he was very angry, something like that? It's up in verse 12. The king was violently angry and commanded to destroy all the men of Babylon. So there's the king. Daniel goes in to see the king. So he's really upset right now. He's ready to kill people. He's ready to kill the wise men of Babylon. And he's an older man running the entire world. Now remember, Daniel was carried away captive in the first wave of captivity of Babylon. We get that from Kings and actually from Daniel chapter 1. Daniel was not married yet, and yet he was of the royal family. That tells us that Daniel was probably 13, 14 years old, 15, probably no older than 15. So now it's been 2 more years, so maybe he's 17, more likely probably 16 or even 15. And here he is, so place him even as a 17-year-old in front of the angry king who's just commanded that all the wise men be killed. So when the king speaks, it isn't, it isn't like, Daniel, are you able to make known the dream that I've seen? It's more like, are you able to tell me this dream that I've seen, or are you one of those fakes? And if so, I'm going to have your head cut off right here and now in my throne room. He's mad, he's fierce. And you get this 17-year-old kid, and you think about maturity today and how so many times kids don't grow up. They spend so much time, watching TV or playing video games. They aren't making tough decisions. They aren't engaging life the way they need to engage life. And Daniel, he's been carried captive out of his homeland. He's engaged life. And so even in the presence of the king like that, he doesn't back down. He doesn't melt away. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. And he stood his ground. Mary, the same, probably about, well, a little younger than Daniel, probably, when the angel shows up, says, be it unto me according to your word. These kids in that environment that are the great heroes of faith, they went and did, and just fabulous people. We can certainly learn from them. So anyway, he said, are you able to make known to me the dream? Verse 27, Daniel answered before the king and said, the secret that the king has asked about is not able to be explained to the king by the wise men, enchanters, magicians, or diviners. No kidding. And he obviates that right up front. Verse 28, but there's a God in heaven. He doesn't point to himself. He says there's a God in heaven who reveals secrets, because if Nebuchadnezzar is going to change and going to be saved and going to be in the resurrection of the just, he's got to recognize God. Now, he went through a rough patch, but did Nebuchadnezzar come to the point that he recognized God? And he did. And I want to take you to Daniel chapter 4, because I think this is pretty important. Because when I talk to people about Nebuchadnezzar, a lot of times what I hear from people is, oh, that guy was terrible, and I'm sure he's going to go to hell and that kind of thing. But these are the last words of Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible, in Daniel chapter 4, verse 37. And I believe it's because of Nebuchadnezzar's interaction with Daniel and men like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, because all his works are truth and his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. And those are the last words of Nebuchadnezzar, and that's why I believe that you and I are going to see him in the future, and he's going to live forever like we are. In contrast, you read about Solomon. He's the wisest guy, and yet in the closing chapter of his life, 1 Kings chapter 11, it says Solomon did that which was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. And I don't know about the everlasting life of Solomon, but I believe very firmly that Nebuchadnezzar will be in the resurrection of the just. So back to the text of Daniel chapter 2, 27. So the diviners aren't able to do this, but for 28, there's a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he's made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head on your bed are these. As for you, O king, your thoughts came into your mind on your bed about what should happen in the future. Now that's going to resonate with Nebuchadnezzar. He's going to go, okay, you're right so far. I was thinking about the future. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will happen. But as for me, this secret was not revealed to me because of any wisdom that I have, more than any other living person. And again, he's going to be giving credit to God here, but so that its interpretation may be made known to the king, to you, and so that you may understand the thoughts of your heart, because then Nebuchadnezzar is going to use that knowledge again to influence the people in his kingdom. Verse 31, as you were looking, O king, and behold, there was a large statue. This statue, which was mighty and of exceeding brightness, was standing before you, and its appearance was frightening. It's shining, it's powerful. What does it mean? Verse 32, as for the statue, its head was of fine gold, its breast and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet part of iron and part of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out, but not by human hands, and it struck the statue on its feet that were of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken in pieces together and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. this is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation. And you guys know the interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. The Medo-Persian Empire is the chest of silver. The thighs of bronze are the Grecian Empire. And I believe, and I think there's good commentary on this, that the toes and feet have to do with the caliphate and the Arabic Empire that's going to be around at the time the Antichrist shows up. And there's good commentary on that. And I don't have the time tonight to go into developing how all that works. But if we go back to almost everybody, this is kind of funny because almost all the commentators know that the stone that was cut out, but not by human hands, is the Messiah. And he destroys all the kingdoms of the earth. But then it says right here that no trace of them could be found, but the stone that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. Where does going and living in heaven forever come from? You know, it's amazing how traditions are so powerful when the Word of God is right in front of us. And it tells us that the Messiah's kingdom is going to fill the whole earth. And then the question is, are there other verses that say that? There's a whole bunch of other verses. We're not going to look at them, but Psalm 2:8, Psalm 72, 8-11, Daniel 2:35, Daniel 7:14, Micah 5:4, Zechariah 9:9-10. These are just some of the verses. Then what did Christ say in the Sermon on the Mount? The meek will inherit the earth. What's it say in Revelation chapter 4? That the people who follow Christ will reign on the earth. You know, it's just astounding to me that the Bible can be so clear, and yet in people's brains, the tradition just takes ascendancy, and somehow or other, all these verses don't make an impact, and we're going to go to heaven and live there forever, which isn't at all what's going to happen. Well, in closing out the teaching, when Daniel shows this interpretation to the king and says in verse 45, the God has made known to the king what will happen in the future. The dream is certain and its interpretation sure. Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and prostrated himself before Daniel, and that must have blown the people in the courtroom away. Everybody stands in front of the king, and the king falls on his face before Daniel. And you know, that's kind of like 1 Corinthians 14, where it says if we prophesy to people and we tell them truths that we get from the Spirit, that they will say that God is in you of a truth. When people sense that God is working in us, it moves them in a very powerful and marked way. And it's one of the reasons that we've got to take risks and we've got to push ourselves in the Spirit to talk to people, to pray for people, to see, you know, the kind of thing we can do. And then, of course, the Nebuchadnezzar was good for his promise about gifts and stuff. He made Daniel great, gave him many gifts, made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, chief governor over all the wise men of Babylon. Again, that's going to involve his rulership over the Magi. And Daniel, again, selfless, watching out for the things of God, requested of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel was in the gate of the king, where the king had access to him and he had access to the king. So this is a wonderful record. We can learn an awful lot from it. Thank you for your attention. It's been a blessing to share this. It was a blessing to study it. And I love the way God set it up in my life. Just one of those things that happens. So God bless you all.